Good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to our Sunday with Survivors program. My name is Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. Before we start our program today, I wanted to put in a plug for some of our other upcoming online programs. This Wednesday, we have two programs. The first at 10 a.m. in-person yoga on the lawn behind our building in the Wellwind Preserve. So come and enjoy the tranquility of the Wellwind Preserve as the trees begin to bloom, and enjoy some yoga with us on Wednesday morning. Then at noon on Wednesday, I will be hosting my next Curator's Corners program, focusing on a photograph from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. As you may know, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising started on April 19th, 1943. So 78 years ago tomorrow. So on Wednesday, I'll be talking about a photograph from that event. And then this coming Thursday, April 22nd at 7 p.m., we'll be hosting a screening of a documentary film entitled Bullied, A Student, a School, a Case That Made History. The film chronicles one middle and high school student's ordeal at the hands of anti-gay bullies, and offers an inspiring message of hope for those fighting harassment today. The program is going to be hosted with the commentary by Stephen Mast, a social worker who's been working on Long Island for more than 30 years. So I hope you'll join us for that program too. To learn more about any of these programs and all of our online programming, you can go to our website, www.hmtcli.org, and click on the events tab. Okay, with those announcements taken care of, let me move to introduce the man who launched our Sunday with Survivor program, Michael Mantell, who will get our program going. Michael is a 3G. Two of his grandparents are survivors, and they sparked in him a desire to not let the experiences that they and other survivors went through be forgotten. Near the end of last year, Michael and some of his family approached HMTC about organizing a private program to hear the testimony from survivors. And after having several programs underway just for his family, we realized that this was a program that should be open to the public. And thus the Sunday with Survivors program was started. So I'm very grateful for the support and interest of Michael and his family, and leave it to him to say a few more words about our program this evening. Michael?
Thank you so much, Thorin, and thank you to everyone at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center for helping to make this monthly Sundays with Survivors program possible, and for all the work you do to further the mission of educating young people on the lessons of the Holocaust. Thank you to everyone here as well for being part of this live virtual event, and a special thank you to Mr. Werner Reich for your willingness to share your testimony with us. Welcome to another Sundays with Survivors. The power of the Sundays with Survivors program is that it gives people the opportunity to listen to and speak with Holocaust survivors when they may otherwise not have had the chance. It also gives survivors the opportunity to share their stories with people all over the world. This program, like Jewish tradition, transmits our stories and our history from one generation to another. In this way, today, you become part of that story and are part of the mission of preserving Mr. Reich's legacy. While we listen, we are present with our bodies and our minds, and we begin to imagine the scenario of today's testimony, and may even have a visceral reaction, and that's okay. While I listen to the testimonies of survivors, I do feel stricken with sadness and hopelessness. But after these talks, I somehow begin to feel a little bit more hopeful. These survivors went through so much and survived, and if they did, I can. But also if they did, then in that tradition, I too shall never forget and never give up. We're here to bear witness, and the act of bearing witness does not only take place today, but just like Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and Israel's Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, it is a day that we are present for and take with us the lessons and legacies from this day forward. That is our promise to the survivors, to listen to their testimonies and to educate others. As the grandson of Holocaust survivors, I am thankful for all of the survivors who share their stories and to organizations like the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center for making events like these possible. And again, I would like to thank everyone for being here today. And if you would like to learn more about the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, or would like to donate, volunteer, or visit the center's museum, or inquire about their educational and community outreach, please visit their website at hmtcli.org. Thank you again, and with that, I'll pass it back to Thorin.
Thanks, Michael. Today, as you know, we will be hearing the testimony from Werner Reich. As Michael mentioned, the act of listening to testimony is an important and privileged act. We understand that by hearing from a witness, we too become witnesses, and we become entrusted with not only remembering the Holocaust, but also responding to hate, bigotry, and intolerance in our world today. Werner Reich is going to share his testimony for about an hour, and then we've got about 25 to 30 minutes for Q&A. If you have questions that come up during his presentation, his testimony, please type them into the Q&A window through Zoom. And also at the end of the program, if we'd use the Q&A window to enter any questions you have, and then we'll make sure that Mr. Reich is able to respond. So with that, I'd like to invite Werner Reich to come onto the stage, and I pass the virtual stage to him. Werner?
Good afternoon or good evening, depends which time zone you are in. My story may sound a little bit sort of bizarre to most of you, but it was a typical story of children from Western Europe. We were born in one country, and we were given the opportunity for several years after Hitler's arrival to power in Germany to escape to different parts of Europe and overseas. It was very, very difficult to get overseas, so many people thought in Germany in 1933, 1934 that Hitler will last for a couple of years, and therefore it wasn't worthwhile to go anywhere else. So they settled in some other country in Europe. And obviously a couple of years later, when we tried to leave Europe for America or South America, all the doors were closed. We were then in different countries. We had to hide and were arrested, dragged through the camps, and came back home and found nothing. Eastern European kids didn't have the luxury of hiding for any length of time. They were immediately arrested and taken to the camps and killed there. I was born in Germany, in Berlin, in 1927. And when I was 6 years old, in 1933, Hitler came to power. And Hitler immediately placed, within the first 6 months, several laws on the books. One of them was that Jews could not work for major corporations, Jews could not work for universities or hospitals. And then there was also a law which indirectly affected the Jews, that schools could not be overcrowded. And obviously that meant that the principals of any school could eliminate any student they wanted to, because these students were overcrowding the schools, and obviously the students who were overcrowding the schools were Jewish. So Jews could not go to school, and Jews could not earn a living. Hitler in 1933, 1934 had no intention of killing Jews. He just wanted to get rid of them. He wanted to make it economically impossible for them to make a living. Doctors had to treat patients but could not collect money from the insurance companies. Jews could not hire non-Jews. For instance, if you had a department store, you couldn't hire anybody. And so Jews left Germany, and we left Germany in 1933. My father was a mechanical and an electrical engineer. He worked for Siemens, and we left Germany and we went to Yugoslavia, which was 3 countries away. It was the same year and about the same time that Anne Frank and her family left Germany and left Berlin, and they went to Holland. Uh, so we came to Yugoslavia, and I had to go to school, but obviously I couldn't speak Croat, and so I went to a German school run by the local evangelical church. And I went there for the first year. And after the first year, I was checked into a Croat school. And from that point on, all my schooling was in Croat, which forced me to learn another 2 new handwritings. In the German school, I had learned the German handwriting, which is now totally old, it's not used anymore. And I had to learn a new Latin standard handwriting and Cyrillic, which is very much similar to the Russian handwriting. And I had a very, very happy childhood. I didn't have the slightest idea why we left Germany and went to Yugoslavia. My sister and I, we just adopted very fast. My father had very, very great difficulty. First of all, we had no money because my father had to sell the house for next to nothing. People in Germany knew that he was a Jew and he had to sell the house because he had to leave. So they offered him next to nothing. And then when we left the country, we had to pay 25% of all of our property as tax for leaving Germany. So when we came to Yugoslavia, which was a completely agricultural country, my father couldn't earn a living because nobody needed an engineer there. They needed farmers. At that time, when we came to Yugoslavia, the illiteracy rate was about 75%. People were not interested in science or anything beyond that. So life was very difficult. The other problem was, which sort of came up as time went on, was that my parents were typically Victorian. They had a very formal relationship with us children. Whenever a serious subject was discussed, like the Nazis or anything like that, we children were sent out of the room. And therefore, I knew absolutely nothing about what was happening in Germany and what was happening around the world. The newspapers were strictly government controlled, and the government didn't want to start any stink with Germany. And the radio stations were government controlled, and so were the newspapers. And we lived like that. And then my father got sick, and it took me 30 years after his death that I found out by chance what he died from. It was a kidney disease. But as a child, I didn't have the slightest idea what he was sick from or how he was treated or anything of the sort. We lived like that until 1940. I had a very, very happy life. I had Jewish friends and non-Jewish friends. I had Muslim friends, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Catholics. I had friends of all different religions. I've never, ever encountered anti-Semitism while I was a child. I belonged to a Jewish Zionist organization, Hashomer HaTzair, and in the summer we went to summer camps, and on a weekly basis we met at the local Jewish community center, and we sang songs and talked about Israel, and it was a very innocent, very pleasant time. And then in 1940, my father died. And a few months later, I was 13 at that time, Germany invaded Yugoslavia. And my mother was afraid that something would happen to me and my sister. My mother had been a typical, very, very good German woman. During World War I, she was a nurse in the German military, and she saved the lives of a great number of German soldiers, and she was awarded the Iron Cross. And she was very proud of it. It had a citation that came with the Iron Cross, which stated that the gratitude of the fatherland will be with you forever. I'm sorry. And she firmly believed in that. She was also, through her father, an American citizen. So until really the war started in 1941, she felt assured that nothing would happen. But definitely the Iron Cross was the guarantee that she would be safe. But she wasn't sure about my sister and myself. So she placed my sister with one family and placed me with another couple. And the placement with the other couple was, in retrospect, really silly, because she placed me with a couple who worked for the resistance movement. And when that was 1941, when the Germans attacked Yugoslavia, and within a couple of days, Germany occupied Yugoslavia. We didn't, she placed me with a couple who were working against the German government. And the German government really wasn't looking for Jews, but it was looking for people who were trying to sabotage the German victory in Yugoslavia, because at the same time, that the Germans invaded Yugoslavia, the resistance movement developed, particularly in Serbia and Bosnia, and they were fighting the Germans. And obviously, the Germans were looking for people who were fighting them. We were living in Zagreb in a big town, and this couple was obtained films from the resistance movement and developed these films and pictures and made enlargements from them, and then somehow sent these pictures back to whoever it was. And I learned how to develop these. My mother had placed me with this couple, and I learned how to develop films and how to make enlargements and do all that work. I was there for 2 years. I couldn't wear shoes because people in the apartment beneath would hear me. I couldn't go near the window because people from the street would see me. And I read a lot of books at that time. I had no friends whatsoever. I couldn't go out on the street because we had to wear a yellow star. I didn't have the slightest idea what was going out in the world or what was happening. If you went out on the street and there was a German soldier or a Croat soldier out on the sidewalk, you had to step into the gutter. And if they saw your stars, people would sometimes throw garbage at you and so on. As I said, until the arrival of the Germans, I've never ever experienced anti-Semitism. But shortly after they had arrived, and before I was in hiding, I went to school, and one of the teachers asked me a question, and I gave the wrong answer. And he looked at me and said, "The answer is wrong because you are a Jew." And this was the first time in my life that I ever encountered anti-Semitism. A couple of days later, my mother was called in and was told that I can't go to school anymore. And this applied to all the other Jewish kids. Anyway, I was living in hiding, and the newspapers were praising the Germans, and you couldn't, and the radio was praising the Germans. You couldn't listen to foreign stations. It was illegal. If you listen, there was one radio station on shortwave that was the BBC. But if they caught you listening to the BBC, then you were arrested and thrown in jail, and God knows what happened to you. I lived like this in limbo for 2 years. I saw my mother maybe every couple of months once. She came and looked, wanted to see how I'm doing and so on. And that was it. I was with these strangers with whom I had absolutely no relationship whatsoever. They were a couple in their late 30s. They didn't have any children, and they were not particularly interested in me either. After roughly 2 years, by the time I was 15, there was a knock at the door one morning, and 6 Gestapo agents came in, German secret police, and they tore everything from the closets out on the floor. They covered the entire floor with They emptied the bookshelves, emptied clothing, whatever there was. And one man was watching over me with a gun in his hand. And at one point, I was sleeping in the living room on a couch, and at one point I wanted to go to the bathroom, and he told me that's okay. And I went to the bathroom, and while I was sitting on the toilet, he pointed the gun at me. And I thought it was the best laxative I've ever had in my life. uh, Afterwards, they told me I can get dressed. And I got dressed, and they took me down to their local headquarters, which was an old office building. And I was brought into the office of a Gestapo agent, a small man with huge hands. I don't know, he must have been a butcher or something at one point. And he questioned me, and it made absolutely no difference what answer I gave him. And I knew absolutely nothing, really. I knew nothing about where the films came from or where the pictures went to. Whatever he asked me, he hit me. And I was flying across that room, and at one point I hit my head on the desk, and I was bleeding all over his carpet, and I was crying. And this went on for a couple of hours, and then they took me into the basement, and they locked me up in a cell, which was originally a coal cellar. And there was concrete floor and a bucket to be used as a toilet, and that was it. I didn't have the slightest idea that these people were capable and that they would kill people. And I was constantly convinced that because I'm innocent, they will let me go. My, if my parents would have given me one hint of who these people were, I think I would have thought completely different, but I was totally naive. I didn't know what a concentration camp was until I came into one. And so I was seeing myself, you know, that they will let me go any moment. I was locked up there for 3 days. So the shock of being locked up and being beaten for nothing was already a huge shock, because I've never heard about things like that. And after 3 days, they transported me to Slovenia, and I was locked up in a little town on the border of Slovenia in a wooden shed, which they have used. It was a sort of a tool shed which they had used as a prison. It was a small town, and I doubt whether they ever had any more serious criminals there than somebody being drunk. Anyway, I was in short sleeve shirt and short pants. It was May, and I was attacked by millions of fleas, and they really went crazy on me. I squeezed into the corner of the shed just to hide part of my body, but it was just horrible. I was there for 3 days, and after 3 days, a man came and he took me on a trade to Austria. And I still kept wondering how, A, where am I? And B, how am I going to get home? I was still so terribly naive about this whole thing. And I just wondered, when is it going to happen? And we traveled, we went onto a train and went into a compartment. There was somebody else sitting there, and this uh, Gestapo man told the couple of people who were in the compartment to leave. And I and the Gestapo men and a whole bunch of fleas were in this compartment, and obviously must have infected the compartment. And we traveled like that from Slovenia to Graz, Austria. And I found myself in Graz, Austria at a railroad station, and there was a police car with a black Mariah waiting for me, with complete with bars, and a whole bunch of people standing around and wondering who the criminal will be, whom they are going to, who's going to be transported. And it felt sort of weird. They opened the door in the back, and this little kid came and went inside. And I, they drove me to the local police headquarters, which was a 3-story office building where the first 2 floors were sort of a 16-foot high, very, very high ceilings. And the top floor was just a regular 6, 7, 8-foot, 7-foot ceiling. And I was brought there and taken up to the top floor and locked up in a prison cell, holding cell. Remember, it was a police station, it was not a jail. So it was the holding cell had 4 beds in it, 4 very narrow beds. People were brought in just for a day or 2, and that was it. And then they were taken to the court, and from there on, either released or placed in jail. And I was put into a cell there, and that's where I had my only revenge on the German government, because I infected that cell and all the adjacent cells with fleas. And in addition to me in that cell, there were 3 other kids, but they were not Jewish. 2 of them had been arrested for burglary, and the 3rd kid had killed his mother. And I was the 4th criminal there. And I was there for 6 weeks. Once a day, they let us out in the police station yard. And that was that. One day, I looked out of the window into the police station yard. Remember, it was something like normally a 5-story high. There was the window, and then there were the bars. You couldn't, the bars were first, and then there was the window. You couldn't touch the window. And I looked out in the police station yard, and down there I saw my mother with some other women walking around in a circle. And that was the last time I ever saw my mother. I never tried to find out what happened to her, because what I went through afterwards, I didn't want her to be in any of those positions. And a couple of years ago, while I was in Israel, I went to Yad Vashem, and I asked if they knew anything about my mother, and the last place they knew of her was She was in Terezin, in the Graz in the jail, and that's the last record they had. But I got a few records of my own from my own history, because obviously I didn't have the Germans didn't give me anything after that. I was there for 6 weeks, and then one day they came and they put me into a police car, and we traveled from Graz to Vienna. It was very, very uncomfortable because in the back of a police car, the seats are parallel to the street. So you're moving from side to forward and backward. And it was very difficult. It was really hard sitting there. And we traveled to Vienna. Eventually, we ended up in Vienna, and I was taken to a synagogue that had been destroyed during the night of the broken glass. At one point, it was a magnificent synagogue. I've got some pictures of the synagogue before it was destroyed, but during the night of the broken glass, the synagogue had been destroyed, and there was soot and dirt on the floor, and the place was a complete mess. There were torn prayer books, torn prayer shawls, and it was just a mess. And there were about 120 other people in the room, and children, and they all had luggage, and I had nothing. I had just the clothes on my back, the same clothes that I started off with when I left Zagreb some 2 months before, and 6, 7 weeks before. We were there overnight, and the next day we were taken to the railroad station and placed into a normal compartment, and they locked the doors, and suddenly there were SS men appearing, and I've never seen an SS man before. And these guys, they were just marching up and down and making sure that all the doors are locked and all the windows are locked. And we traveled like that for 2 days. And after 2 days, we found ourselves in Czechoslovakia in a place called Terezin, or as the Germans called it, Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was a 150-year-old fortress that the Czechs had built against the German invasion. And when in the early 1900s planes were invented, the fortress became useless because all you do is you fly over them, and they fly over the fortress and you drop a couple of bombs, and that was the end. So the military moved out, and about 3,000 people, local, citizens, moved in, and they worked the fields, and they had a very nice little town there. And when the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939, they decided that this would be a very good place for a concentration camp. But at that time already, and within the next year or so, 1940 in particular, the Swiss authorities, the Red Cross, and the Swedish authorities complained that the Germans were mistreating the Jews and not treating them according to the Geneva Convention. So the Germans said we are going to make this correction. And what they did was they brought in strictly the intelligentsia of Germany, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Holland, and also later on a few people from Denmark. And they gave the children crayons and paper, and the adults, they gave them musical instruments. So, and they even put a couple of Jews in charge of the administration of the town. There were only a couple of problems involved with this. The problem was that number one, the food was lousy, and number two, the place was overcrowded. They put 60,000 people in where before 3,000 people lived. So they solved the problem, but whenever there was an inspection, they improved the food and they sent people to Auschwitz, to the gas chambers. About 141,000 people really were sent to Terezin, and about 17,000 survived. I was there for 10 months. I worked, I laid railroad tracks, I exterminated vermin, I made baskets, I did all different types of work. And after 10 months, they brought in a whole bunch of railroad cars, and they put 100 people of us in each railroad car. They brought in a bucket, and they locked the doors. And these were cattle cars. There were no seats or anything. People, we had to sit on the floor, we had to scrunch on the floor. And obviously after an hour, the bucket overflowed, and we traveled for the next 3 days, not knowing where, because we couldn't see. There were no windows in the car, and people were dying, and the smell was horrendous. And after 3 days, they opened the doors, and we were blinded by the sunlight. We just tried to step out of the railroad cars, but we were all scrunched up. We were all sitting on the floor, and we could hardly stand. And there were a bunch of guys in striped uniforms and also SS men with walking sticks, and they were hitting us and beating us and mistreating us in every possible way. And once we got out, there were people lying on the floor, crying and bleeding. And it was like a scene out of hell. We were surrounded by electrically charged barbed wire, and these screaming men in striped uniforms who spoke all different languages, which we couldn't even understand. It turned out we were in Auschwitz, Auschwitz II to be precise. And we were brought into the camp, and there was no selection at that time, because we were brought in strictly to be preserved for a little period of time, because again, the Swiss authorities said, we know that there were people here, but where are they now? And in case if they wanted to inspect us, we were still alive. Everybody was given a postcard, on which they could write, preferably, we are healthy, we are happy, we are here, love so and so, and then these postcards were sent off at the cost of the German government, and people received them and they believed that everybody was fine. Anyway, we arrived there and we were immediately faced by some prisoners who've been there already a few months, and they told us, you'll be here for about 6 months. And after 6 months, you'll leave the camp through the chimney. And we felt it was a very stupid joke. There was nothing funny about it. And particularly as we were not quite sure what they were talking about. All we knew is we saw a few hundred yards from us 4 buildings. Each of them had a big chimney, and there was black smoke uh, blacking out the sky. There was a smell of burning hair and burning flesh. We were all our property was taken, all our clothes was taken, and we were given striped uniforms and underwear, and that was that. And we were given a tattoo on our arms, and that made us prisoners of Auschwitz. The most people talk in terms of Auschwitz, as a horrible camp, but in comparison to other camps, Auschwitz, except for the killing of the people, Auschwitz was not a bad camp. There were 3 meals a day. They were miserable. They were a total of roughly 400 calories a day. We got a aluminum bowl and a spoon, and these were our only properties. We got some brown water in the morning and a slice of bread made out of flour and sawdust. For lunch, we got salt water into which tiny little pieces of dirty, unwashed potatoes had been cut. And in the evening, we got the same type of a soup. Sometimes there were nettles in it, or there were some little pieces of unwashed turnips in it. And we got another slice of bread. There are estimates that we got about roughly 400, 450 calories a day. People who were big and heavy before they came in the camp, they were the first who really died because they were given totally insufficient food. There were some Polish Orthodox Jews who were brought into the camp who refused to eat the food because it wasn't kosher. Obviously, they died. There was a tremendous monotony in the camp. And there was, I cannot describe how monotonous it was because we didn't have a calendar. There was no weekday and weekend. Everything was nonstop from one day to the next. There was absolutely no difference. We didn't have any watches. We didn't know when any time was. There were no colors in the camp. There were uh, gray barracks and muddy ground, and there were the gray skies. I can hardly recall ever seeing sunshine. There were no flowers. There were no trees. There were no birds. And I never understood why. I've never seen a bird while I was there, and the sky was constantly covered with smoke. By the time when we came, all the Hungarian Jews were brought in. And the food was muddy and sort of a gray looking, and the people all looked the same. They were gaunt and had no hair and all looked the same. Just either they were small or they were tall, but they were all skinny. And we never got any good news. The only time we ever got good news was indirectly when in January 1945, when we heard the Russian guns and planes, but that was spoiled afterwards because we were not left there. And there was an underlying continuous fear. And there was a 24/7 fear, which we tried to deny because it was totally inescapable. It was as if you were caught in a trap. It was extremely scary, but nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to admit that they were scared, but we were terrified because any moment our turn would be. While I was there one day, a camp, one of the camps adjacent to us was filled with Jehovah's Witnesses, and another camp was filled with gypsies. And one day, all the Jehovah's Witnesses were sent to the gas chamber, and another day, the gypsies. We heard these people knew exactly what was happening. And they were crying and screaming. The Hungarian Jews didn't know what was happening. They just walked into the camp and into the gas chamber. But the other people, they've been there. They were fully cognizant of what was expected. I was there for a couple of months from May till July 6th. And on July 6th, Dr. Mengele did a selection around all the young men in our camp. There were about 6,000 of us. There were, and of the 6,000, there were a few hundred young boys, maybe 1,000 or so. And we had to strip naked and run past Dr. Mengele. And he stood there with a bunch of boys and he was laughing, and with a bunch of SS-men, and he was laughing, telling jokes. And as we passed by, he occasionally nodded or showed with his finger, and he separated. And when he was finished with it, there were roughly 300 of us on one side. And then we had to run again, and there were 200, and we were running for our lives. We were trying to look taller and stronger and healthier and happier, anything that would save your life. It's amazing what you can think of in case of an emergency. And when he was finished with that, we had to run a third time, and there were eventually 89 of us left. And the 89 of us were sent to another camp, and the remaining prisoners, the roughly 6,000 in the camp, over the next 3 days were sent to the gas chambers. I was sent from there. I stayed there for a few more months, and then I was sent to Auschwitz I, which was strictly for criminals. They were all murderers and thieves and sexual predators and rapists and you name it. The dregs of Germany, people who had spent time in prison and were sent to Auschwitz to work as guards for the remaining camps. And I was sent there to work in the stables. And I worked in the stables, feeding horses and brushing them and cleaning the stables. And I was there for several months until January 1945. And we heard the Russians advancing. And that at that point, we were overjoyed. But it was at Christmas that all the German criminals were put into German uniforms and were sent to the Russian front. I don't think any of them ever survived because they were put in the front rows and were just probably gunned down by the Russians as they went in. But 60,000 of us prisoners were given a piece of bread and we started on a death march. It was sub-zero temperature in January 1945. It was unbelievably cold. And we were cold because we had thin uniforms which were made out of dishcloth. We had no fat on our bodies. And we were out in the cold and we were hungry. And so we walked for a couple of hours and stopped, and those who couldn't get up were shot. And this continued for the whole day and continued. The first night we slept in some stables, and the next day we slept in a silo on a concrete floor in the winter. I've never slept on anything as cold as that. It was like sleeping on an ice block. And you lost total empathy for anybody else. It was strictly a question of taking care of yourself. People were crying, help me, help me. But if you tried to help somebody, you wouldn't have helped them. You would have helped them for maybe 5 steps or 6 steps, and then you would have collapsed yourself. After 3 days, we stopped at a railroad siding, and at the railroad siding, by the time we arrived, 15,000 of the 60,000 were dead. They were frozen to death. And the rest of us were loaded into open railroad cars, just plain steel open railroad cars where coal is being carried. And then the train started moving. I cannot describe to you how cold can be. To be in a moving car, in an open moving car in the winter in sub-zero temperature is unbelievable. I can recall what happened the first day and a half, but we were on that train for 4 days. I haven't got the slightest idea what happened after that. I must have passed out or what. A huge number of people just died. In the beginning, we threw the bodies over the edge of the railroad car up on top of the following cars. There were German soldiers sitting there with guns, on German kids, 15-year-old kids with guns. And we didn't want to try to find out what happened, if we tried to escape. But there was no place to escape to because we were we were traveling through fields and frozen ground. If you fell out of the car, you would have been dead anyway. It's like falling onto a concrete ground. And after 4 days, we found ourselves in Austria, in Mauthausen. a concentration camp from hell. It made Auschwitz look like the French Riviera. It was absolutely horrendous. Even before we came, it was a camp for badly behaved prisoners of war, and they were stripped naked in the winter and sprayed with water. They had to walk up 186 steps and then to the top of a cliff, and then they had to push each other off the cliff into the valley. They called it parachute jumping without a parachute. Anyway, we tried to get out of the railroad cars, and we had great difficulty standing. It was like standing on tennis balls. I could hardly move. Eventually, we got into the camp, which was just a few hundred yards from the railroad tracks. And then we were showered, and we collapsed, screaming with pain. It was the most horrible pain I ever endured. We were all frostbitten. Some people died on the spot. And we were brought into the camp, and after 3 days, my feet started to rot. There was a Serbian prisoner of war who had been a doctor before the war. He got a knife from somewhere, and he cut off my toes on one foot and part on the other foot, and that's how he saved my life. He had somewhere some paper. I don't know where he got the paper from, maybe because they were prisoners of war, and he wrapped up my toes like that. And then things really deteriorated, and things got really bad, because the SS abandoned us. They just left us, and nobody would dare to come into the camp. And there was no food there. They brought in a little bit of bread. We ended up getting a tablespoon of moldy bread a day. That's it. I slept next to a dead man for 3 days just to get his ration. I couldn't walk. People were getting diseases. There were huge piles of bodies inside the barracks, inside our barrack. At the end of the barrack, there was a pile of bodies, and that pile sort of moved slightly, because many of the people were not really dead, but they were totally out. They were still breathing, but they were just put there because there was no way that they could ever recover. And these piles were sort of quivering, and it became absolutely hopeless. We were in the clothing that we had from Auschwitz, hadn't been washed or hadn't been cleaned. And I wore the same clothing for 4 months. And it was covered inside and outside with feces and urine and dirt and mud. And I didn't care, nor did anybody else. I met some 15, 20 years ago a GI who had liberated the camp, and he said they could smell the camp 10 miles away. 10 miles. And on the 5th of May, we were liberated by American forces. And the American forces suddenly found themselves with thousands of diseased people, thousands of dead bodies, and no food and no medication or anything. And they had a huge problem on their hands. They had to make sure that these people didn't escape from the camp and spread diseases around the countryside. On the other hand, the American soldiers had to continue fighting because the war was still going on. Eventually, they had to find food for us. So the only food they really had were military rations, the K rations. And they gave us these rations, and about 20,000 people died. I ate a can of chewing tobacco at that time. I didn't have the slightest idea what it was and how it, what it could be. And about 3 weeks after liberation, they told us we should go home. There was no rehabilitation. There was no camp for ex-prisoners or anything of the sort. They just told us leave. And I hitchhiked by train back from Austria to Yugoslavia, which was a huge mistake because I went right into the belly of the communists. And once I came to Yugoslavia, I had my friends were all dead. I had no family there. I had nothing. There was absolutely no reason why I should have gone back. But on the other hand, I didn't know where else to go. I had no reason to go anywhere else either. So I was back in Yugoslavia and I worked on I went to a Yugoslav school for partisans, which was really more or less an indoctrination school for the Communist Party than anything else. And then after I ended up in a hospital in the very beginning. I was very, very weak. I was at that time 17 years old and I weighed 64 pounds. And in the hospital, they had very little food. It was wartime or the end of the war, and people haven't been working the fields. They've been in the military. So as I said, I was there for about a year and a half when I got a notice from the Yugoslav government that I have to join the military. And to join the military in Serbia, to join a second chemical division. And I had enough of military and chemicals and the idea of spending more time under military rule, under restrictions and so on, I just couldn't take it. By this time, I had enough. I decided I'm not going to join the club. And by hook and by crook, I managed to get myself out of Yugoslavia to England. And when I came to England, I had an uncle there who really got me out of a little bit out of Yugoslavia, not quite. And when I came to England, I had no schooling, I had no skills, and I couldn't speak English. So I started working as a laborer and then as a machine tool fitter, then as a tool and die maker. I got married and I came to the United States and I started a family, and I have two fabulous sons who have two absolutely fabulous families. I have four grandchildren, and they and I went for 10 years to college at night to get my degree. And I am happy. Life has been good to me. I know it sounds sort of weird to say that, but I've seen too many people die, and I've seen too much death that I cannot find words that would say that I've suffered, and in comparison to them. In comparison to them, uh, I didn't suffer. I went through hell, but I'm alive, and life has been good to me, to spare me, to give me a beautiful family. I had been married for 61 years to a most wonderful, wonderful lady. She's unfortunately, she passed on 5 years ago. So I have no complaints. That's all I can say. I think we have to look at life from a relative point of view. We can't just take the worst moment in our lives and say, this was our life. Definitely not. Thank you.
Werner, thank you so much for sharing your testimony with us and sharing your story with us. I know that there are many questions that have already started to come in, and I think Michael Mantell is going to share some of them and pose some of them to you. Michael, can I get you
Thank
back
you.
up here?
Yeah, I can get my camera back on. Sorry. But I can ask the questions in the meantime, but thank you so much, Werner, for sharing your testimony. We do have a bunch of questions. We also have some comments, and I have also on my phone some that people asked. So first of all, people are saying that this is an incredible story, your survival, and something that was asked to me on my phone, but I'm also thinking, and especially the way you finished your testimony, is how did you have this drive to survive after everything you were going through on a day-to-day basis?
Very simple. Number one, I was a teenager, and as a teenager, you believe that you're indestructible. You do lots of stupid things. You take dope, you drive cars at 90 miles an hour into trees. You do all type of a crazy stuff, but you believe that you're indestructible. And that is the first reason. And the second one is, if you are really pushed to not to a point of life or death, you react completely different than most people are really driven in their normal lives to being inconvenienced, or maybe end up in jail, or maybe being fined for whatever they're doing. There was never any question in our lives that anything would happen to us that was less than death. And your behavior changes completely. When your life is on the line, you don't have any scruples. Your morale changes completely. And it's a question of life or death. It's really not a question of an inconvenient life or inconveniences to you or somebody else. You don't give a damn about anybody else. People talk about noble deeds, but this was not a question of noble deeds. This was a question of desperation.
Thank you for answering that and so well. We do have a number of other questions. Somebody is asking, you did mention that you went to Yad Vashem, found out about your mother or the last whereabouts and some information about yourself. Someone asked if you knew what happened or found out what happened to your sister.
I haven't got the slightest idea what happened. I didn't bother to look for years and years, actually 60, 70 years. I didn't bother because number one, I knew she was dead. If she wouldn't have been dead, she would have she would have contacted me, or she would have contacted the Jewish Community Center, and the Jewish Community Center would have contacted me, and so on. So I mean, it wasn't that she survived. I knew that, and I'm really not even today interested where she died. I have been through hell, and I don't want to imagine her in any of the places where I was, or any of the places that I heard existed. I don't want to imagine her. I like to think that she died from a heart attack somewhere in a prison, and that was it, finished. You know, there's nothing, it would be strictly masochistic for me to try to find out what happened to her. You know, it doesn't make any difference. It's too late for.
And what about your sister?
It may
Werner?
sound cruel. It may sound ruthless. It may sound totally inconsiderate, but I have too many pictures, actual pictures in my mind, not from books, not from the internet, but from actual pictures, that I don't want to place her in any of these places. It's as simple as that.
And your sister, Werner?
My sister, she was placed with another family. And after a year with that family, the family told her, look, you have to leave us because it's getting too dangerous for us. So she left, and she tried to escape to Italy. The Italians always had a very, very good relationship with the Jews. Mussolini had a Jewish girlfriend. So the mayor of Rome was Jewish. And when Hitler insisted that the Italians start concentration camps, Mussolini said, no, we are not. So, but what they had was, they had detention camps. The Italians had detention camps where they kept the Jews, but they provided food for them, limited amount of food, because war was going on. And people died in these camps because overcrowding and diseases. But they did not mistreat the Jews. Obviously, and my sister survived that. And she was liberated after about a year in one of these detention camps. She tried to escape to Italy, was arrested at the border and put into one of these camps. And she stayed on in Italy for a few more years. And then she learned Italian now. And then she came to the United States. And she worked as an Italian, German, Croat interpreter, English interpreter. You know, if the good Lord gives you lemons, make lemonade. And she made lemonade, and that was that.
Thank you for sharing that. We also have a few questions that can combine them. One was if you've had any experiences met anyone, any other prisoners or within the camps. And I did hear some of your other talks, but as someone mentioned, can you talk about your magician friend?
Yes.
So I guess, yeah.
Do you want me to talk about him?
I think that would be wonderful.
Yeah. When I came to Auschwitz, with me on the same train, there was a man. Obviously, I didn't, somewhere on the in one of the trains, wherever. Anyway, he was. There was a man who had been in Terezin with me, and when we came to Auschwitz, there were 3-tier bunks, and on each bunk there were 6 people. And I climbed up to the top of one of the bunks, and there was already a man lying there on one side and a man on the other side. And so I went in and I lied next to the one man who was on one side, and he turned out to be a very friendly, very nice man. He must have been about 37 years old. I was at that time 16, and he was extremely friendly and nice to me. And one day I went on I came back from a working assignment in Auschwitz. That was, by the way, before this selection. And he was sitting there with a deck of cards. And to me, it was a miracle because we had absolutely nothing. And to have a deck of cards in Auschwitz was unthinkable. And he was sitting there and he was shuffling these cards. And then he asked me to pick a card, and I picked the card, and he performed a magic trick. And I've never in my life seen a magic trick. I've seen tricks sort of with cards which were more or less spelling tricks and stuff like that, but never a card trick that required what in the card terminology is called a move, something where you do something with the fingers. Normally it's just was it this card or that card, and so on. But he actually switched cards, and I was absolutely astonished, flabbergasted. And then when he finished with that, he, without me even asking, he explained the trick to me. He just, this is something that magicians don't do. Magicians would like to be asked at least, and then it's up to the magician to decide whether he wants to give it to you or not. But he actually gave it to me without even asking. And I remembered every little bit that he said. And obviously I couldn't practice because I had no cards. And I kept on practicing the trick in my mind, in my head. And about 3 years later, when I found myself in England, I bought a deck of cards and I showed this. I tried out this trick. This was the first time I really had money when I was in England, when I was working. And the trick worked beautifully. And I showed it to some friends of mine and they were absolutely delighted. And then I discovered a magic store and I bought some magic tricks there and magic books and so on. it really grew. And in the meantime, I became a member of the International Brotherhood of Magicians. And I also became a member of the Psychic Entertainers Association. And it has given me all these years tremendous joy and pleasure. I still play around with magic tricks, which I developing on my own, and I still spend a fortune on expensive magic books. It's one of my vices, and I just it's an intellectual exercise, really. And the man was really a professional magician, and when he came to Auschwitz, the SS found out about it, and they gave him the playing cards, and they gave him some corks and rubber bands and stuff like that. And he performed for the SS, and he also was teaching them magic tricks. And he survived the war. His wife and his son, they were killed in Auschwitz. He survived. He came to the United States. He remarried a lady who was a concert pianist, and eventually he traveled. He did a lot of cruise ships. He performed a lot of cruise ships. I actually met somebody who saw him perform. I never knew that the man survived until I read in one of the magic magazines that a tattooed magician had died. And they gave the number of the tattoo that the man had. And it was just, I think, 100 numbers from mine. So he obviously came in the same transport, and he was obviously the same man. And then I remembered his name, and the two, but his professional name was different. His professional name was Nivelli, but his real name was Levine. But he took the name Levine and turned it around and made it Nivelle. And then he added an extra L and an I, and so it became Nivelli. So Levine became Nivelli. And that was that.
Thank you. Want to be mindful of the time. Maybe I'll ask
That
you.
should teach you from asking me questions.
No. This is wonderful. Someone actually mentioned that they would love for us to give you extra time so you can keep on going, and I think we all agree. One thing that I always think about is that survivors' stories, their life stories, go on after 1945. So of course we can be here forever asking you about those experiences, including, what it was like to be in England. One question I definitely want to ask you is if there was this change in attitude that you noticed. You were talking about being barred from going to school at one point. At that age, was there this kind of subtle shift in attitude that you noticed? And with that, are there any kind of lessons that we can learn to kind of try to prevent something like this from ever happening again? What we can do?
A shift in attitude. Let me get this clear. The question.
I think what he's asking is, when you experienced being forced from school and you realized that there was anti-Semitism, are there lessons from that experience that we should take today to prevent anti-Semitism or hate today?
To me, hate never made much sense, because I grew up in a multi-faith environment. I had my friends were of all different faiths. And I've never, ever heard anything bad. To me, this anti-Semitism is just plain stupid. You know, most people, they are speaking in generalizations which haven't changed since the Middle Ages, since the year 400. And they follow the same, somebody said the Jews killed Christ. Let's say the Jews did kill Christ, they didn't. What the hell do I, 2,000 years after Christ's death, what do I have to do with it? Why pick on me? You know, stop it. You know, get a life. You know, this is totally idiotic. You know, they come up with these medieval things, even today, that the Jews kill Christian children to use for matzah, when the Torah strictly forbids the eating of blood. That's why we have kosher meat. So it's completely drained of any blood. And here they say we are, you know, they're coming up as this total absolute nonsense, like these people walking around with signs, you won't take our jobs. You know, 3% of the United States is Jewish. How can 3% take 100% of the jobs? That means that everybody would have to have about 33 jobs. I can handle maybe 27, 28, but certainly not 33 jobs, you know. So, I mean, we are talking about such absolute drivel and nonsense that I find it absolutely infuriating. And the other thing is this: they think that the ovens of Auschwitz, that's a funny joke. It isn't a funny joke when you see people taking babies and banging their heads against the walls, when they take knives and open the stomachs of pregnant women and remove the babies and shoot the mothers, or when they take mothers with their children in their arm and shoot the babies. There's nothing funny about it. And people still make jokes about this thing. And I get absolutely furious that over all this type of a behavior. They haven't seen piles of bodies of innocent people, perfectly wonderful people who, doctors, scientists, little children, totally innocent, and they come up to this nonsense of Jews. And, you know, it's a, you know, I wish people would grow up. I really mean it. It's a question of, you know, I cannot talk reason into people like that. They have to sit down and say to themselves, what the hell am I talking about? You know, instead of constantly blaming the Jews for everything. How can 3% of the population be guilty of anything? Statistically speaking, the Jews are one group of people that have the lowest number of incarcerated people in the United States. Nobody looks at that. I don't know. I get furious every time they talk about Israel. They should go to Israel and see how the Arabs and Jews live very happily next to each other. Every street sign, every big announcement is in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. It's absolutely, it's there. And they don't want to listen to this. They live in a world of fantasy. Nobody ever wants to be involved in facts. All they want to do is they want to listen what is more convenient. They can't be bothered to check out anything. And that's what makes me absolutely furious. And in the process, they destroy people, They destroy lives, they destroy culture, they destroy themselves as well in the final analysis. I'm sorry if I
No, it's
I go off the deep
understandable. No,
end. I really get absolutely livid when I hear these things.
I always tell
I'm
people if we
sorry.
don't, I'm sorry, I always tell people if we don't get emotional over this, then we're not experiencing it. I mean, it is infuriating. And,
Yeah, but you see, for instance, let's talk about Auschwitz. Auschwitz wasn't only for Jews. There were so many other groups there. There were Jehovah's Witnesses, there were gypsies, there were homosexuals. There were all different types of people there, not only Jews. And they were killed and they were burned.
And you know, I was thinking from your statement, the thing that I get from that the most, because you also brought up Israel, is what we need people to do is to educate themselves. And again, just to call out the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center.
You know, I can't do it. You have to say, I tell you what, I'm going to try to see this Jewish guy's point of view. Let me see, let me investigate the truth. Let me spend one day on the damn thing. But stop destroying people, stop destroying lives.
Werner,
I get a little bit off the deep end.
can I ask, when did you start telling your story and what motivated you initially?
I retired about 25 years ago, something like that. I retired from my work 25, 27 years ago. And I saw in the local Smithtown newspaper an article which said that the Smithtown High School is opening again, giving a course in Holocaust studies. And inasmuch as the Smithtown High School is about 3 miles from here, I called them up and said, hey, if you need an exhibit, you know, I'm available. And guy said, yeah, come on. So I went up there and I gave my first lecture. And then the next year, another one or two of the Smithtown High School asked me to speak. And then the whole thing exploded. You know, then I started now. The last few years I've been speaking about 100 times a year. And I also spoke overseas in England, and I spoke in Israel. I spoke in Spain, in Portugal, and I spoke in Hong Kong. I went with my son to Hong Kong, and I spoke there maybe 8 times, something like that. I was invited to speak. So I've been.
Well, Werner, I know we've been taking a lot of your time this evening, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I want to let Michael close us out this evening as the guy who's really been behind this whole program. So thank you, Werner, and Michael, I pass it to you.
Thank you, Thorin, and thank you, Werner, and thank you everyone for being here. The Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center is amazing. As Thorin said, when COVID started, I was trying to figure out what to do with my time and what could be something that would be meaningful to bring into this world. So I have the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center to thank Thorin and everyone else there, all the survivors. Thank you, Werner. The one thing that I continuously get reminded when I listen to these testimonies is when I start, I say, I believe we need to hear these stories. After I hear them, I don't say I believe, I say I know that we have to continue to hear these testimonies. So this is now a monthly event, and I thank you for being a part of this, and thank the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center for helping to actualize this stream of mind, to bring these testimonies to our next generation, because we are at our 4th generation right now, and we need to continue these stories so that these lessons don't leave us. So with that, thank you, and thank everyone who's here today. And I hope again that if you're interested in learning about the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, you'll visit the website hmtcli.org. If you can donate, that's wonderful. Volunteer, or if you're interested in any of their services, just check it out. So thank you again. I really appreciate it. And Werner, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening. Thanks, Werner.
Thanks. Take care.
You're welcome.